The empire doesn't announce its own decline, it never does. It dresses the retreat in the language of burden sharing, strategic rebalancing, and the generous redistribution of responsibility. But when you strip away the diplomatic theater and look at the raw architecture of power, what you are witnessing right now in real time in 2026 is something that no living American has ever seen before. The United States of America is losing its commanding grip on the very alliance it built, funded, and ran for more than 7 decades. And simultaneously, its hunger for regime change, that old imperial reflex dressed up in the language of democracy and narco-terrorism, is producing exactly the kind of chaos, blowback, and strategic overreach that historically marks the final chapter of a declining empire. This is not theory. This is not speculation. This is happening right now, and most Americans are not being told the full story. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what is really unfolding, why it matters deeply for every single person living in this country, and why the convergence of these two events, the hollowing out of NATO command and the Venezuela debacle, may well be the two bookmarks on a chapter of American history that future generations will look back on and call the beginning of the fall. Now let's slow down and really get into the bones of this, because the NATO story is being sold to you in a very particular way, and you deserve the full picture. In February of 2026, NATO made an announcement that if you blinked, you might have missed entirely. The alliance restructured its command system, and what that restructuring actually meant was this. The United States handed over Joint Force Command Norfolk to the United Kingdom and relinquished Joint Force Command Naples to Italy. Joint Force Command Brunssum, another critical operational hub, is now rotating between Germany and Poland. These are not ceremonial posts. These are warfighting level commands. These are the nodes of military decision-making through which NATO conducts actual operations, coordinates real forces, and plans real contingencies. And America just walked away from 2 of them. The official language was predictably soothing. NATO described the move as part of a shift to more fairly sharing responsibility within NATO, with European allies taking on greater leadership roles in NATO's command structure. Burden sharing. Fairness, responsibility, beautiful words. But here is what those words are concealing. For nearly 8 decades, the United States sat at the absolute apex of the NATO command architecture. It was American generals who issued the orders. It was American doctrine that shaped the planning. It was American intelligence that fed the situational awareness. And it was American nuclear extended deterrence that formed the ultimate backstop of the entire alliance. That was the deal. Europe provided the geography, the forward bases, the political legitimacy of collective defense. America provided the brain, the spine, and the muscle. And in exchange for all of that, Washington got something priceless: the ability to shape European security outcomes, to position forces wherever it needed them, to run the most strategically important military alliance on the planet as an extension of its own national security apparatus. That arrangement is now being dismantled piece by piece, and what is replacing it is a Europe that is being pushed faster than it is ready to go into taking primary responsibility for its own defense. Analysts now openly acknowledge that further American disengagement from NATO's command structure is likely, perhaps even including the position of Supreme Allied Commander Europe itself, a consequence of Washington's strategic prioritization of homeland defense, the Western Hemisphere, and the Indo-Pacific. Think about what that actually means. The c'est-sûr position has been held by an American officer every single year since 1951. Every year, through Korea, through Vietnam, through the Cold War, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the Balkans, through Afghanistan, through every single geopolitical storm of the modern era. An American wore that uniform and sat in that chair. And now, for the first time in history, that too is on the table. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated, and this is the part that the cable news networks are completely failing to explain to you. The Trump administration's national defense strategy is not simply about saving money or making Europe pay its fair share. That is the populist wrapper. Underneath it, there is a deeper strategic logic being articulated most clearly by people like Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who is the actual intellectual architect of this realignment. The argument goes like this: China is the real threat. The Indo-Pacific is the real theater. Europe is a mature, wealthy civilization that is fully capable of defending itself if it simply chooses to spend the money and generate the political will. And therefore, the United States should gradually transfer European security responsibilities to Europeans so that American military capacity can be redirected toward the Pacific. That is the theory. And in theory, it is not entirely irrational. But here is the problem. Theory meets reality, and reality does not cooperate. If the United States were to fully exit NATO's command architecture, the alliance would not lose its European tanks or frigates or fighter jets overnight, but it would lose the ally that contributes the largest share of spending, a major share of enabling power, and a large part of the command, lift, ISR, and deterrence backbone around which the rest of NATO is built. The biggest loss would not be sheer numbers, but high-end enabling capability. In plain language, Europe has armies. But without the American nervous system, the satellite networks, the strategic airlift, the integrated missile defense, the deep ISR architecture, the nuclear guarantee, those armies are capable of a lot less than their numbers suggest. And so what America is actually doing, whether it fully intends to or not, is creating a European security vacuum that no one is yet equipped to fill. And into vacuums, historically, dangerous things rush. Now let's talk about Venezuela, because this is the other pillar of this story. And it is a story of imperial hubris meeting the limits of imperial power in real time. On January 3rd, 2026, the United States conducted a stunning military operation inside Venezuela. American forces carried out large-scale airstrikes against multiple Venezuelan military facilities, and in the resulting chaos, U.S. Special Forces captured President Nicolas Maduro himself in a nighttime raid on a Caracas safe house. Trump celebrated it as a triumph. He stood at Mar-a-Lago and announced it to the world as if it were the liberation of a continent. And for about 72 hours, it looked like the kind of clean, decisive action that wipes decades of foreign policy frustration off the board in a single night. The problem is that history does not end after 72 hours. Iraq looked like a triumph in 2003, Libya looked like a liberation in 2011, and then came the years after. And in Venezuela, the years after have already begun, and they are not going according to plan. Here is what you need to understand about Venezuela that the triumphalist coverage completely missed. Armed groups active throughout the country are prepared to exploit any power vacuum, including well-drilled colectivos entrenched in poor urban neighborhoods, citizen militias recently mobilized by Maduro, criminal gangs operating across cities and countryside, and the National Liberation Army, a Colombian rebel group with several thousand hardened fighters across Venezuela, committed to turning their guns on any foreign forces that arrive. What that means in practice is that capturing Maduro was the easy part. What comes after is the hard part, and the hard part has no clean ending in sight. The country is not a blank canvas waiting to be painted in American colors. It is a complex, fractured, deeply politicized society with armed networks woven into every layer of its social fabric. And those networks did not dissolve because a man was pulled out of a safe house in the middle of the night. And then there is the oil dimension, which is perhaps the most revealing part of this entire episode, because the official justification for the Venezuela operation was narco-terrorism. Maduro as the kingpin of a cartel state, the protection of American citizens from drug trafficking, that was the public argument. But what the documents, the press conferences, and the internal communications actually revealed was something far more straightforward. Trump himself made clear that oil was a motivation, citing Venezuela's nationalization of its oil industry and suggesting that seized Venezuelan oil could be treated as a U.S. asset, potentially sold or added to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is empire talking directly. This is not dressed up in any particularly sophisticated language. It is the Monroe Doctrine with a price tag attached. And the rest of the world, every single capital on earth that was watching this unfold, took note. Not just of what America did, but of what America said while it was doing it. Because here is the thing that strategic analysts understand, and that the American public is rarely told directly. Every time the United States conducts a military operation like this and then announces that it intends to control the target country's oil resources, it does not just affect that one country. It sends a message to every other country on earth about what the rules actually are. And the message is this: if you have resources that Washington wants, and if Washington decides that your government is inconvenient, then international law is not going to protect you. And when that message gets received, and it always gets received, it accelerates precisely the kind of multipolarity that the United States is simultaneously claiming to resist. Countries that once sat comfortably in Washington's orbit begin quietly diversifying their security partnerships. They start buying Chinese infrastructure. They start settling oil trades in yuan instead of dollars. They start looking for the exit from a system that now feels less like a rules-based international order and more like an imperial protection racket. And that brings us to the deeper structural story underneath all of this. Because the NATO command restructuring and the Venezuela intervention are not two separate events. They are two symptoms of the same underlying condition. Military overreach, economic overextension, and internal polarization have eroded the credibility and coherence of American primacy, and rising powers such as China, India, Iran, and Russia have begun reconfiguring the global order around a new balance of power. The numbers confirm this in ways that are almost uncomfortable to sit with. US public debt surpassed $39 trillion in March 2026, representing more than 120% of American GDP projected for the year, driven by a tax system where big capital enjoys significant exemptions, while the rest of society bears the fiscal burden of the state and its exorbitant military budgets. Think about that for a moment. The United States is spending hundreds of billions of dollars maintaining a global military presence, conducting operations in Venezuela, funding the architecture of NATO command, running aircraft carriers through the Strait of Hormuz, stationing forces across Asia and Europe, and simultaneously carrying a debt load that would have been considered catastrophically unsustainable by any previous standard of American fiscal politics. And who is watching all of this very, very carefully? China, Russia, Iran, every member of BRICS. Every government in the global south that has spent the last 2 decades being told that the American-led international order is the only legitimate framework for global governance. In the Strait of Hormuz right now, Iran and China are actively working to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar in international trade, using yuan-settled oil transactions to build an alternative financial architecture that bypasses American sanctions leverage entirely. This is not incidental. This is strategic. Every time the United States weaponizes the dollar through sanctions, it gives every other country on earth an additional incentive to find an alternative to the dollar. And every time it invades a sovereign country to seize its oil, it gives every resource-rich government on earth an additional incentive to build security relationships with Moscow and Beijing rather than Washington. The BRICS bloc is the other part of this story that gets almost zero serious coverage in American media. The BRICS countries, with new members joining in 2025, now represent more than 40% of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity, compared to the G7's 30%. Let that land. The bloc that American foreign policy has spent decades dismissing as a loose collection of developing economies now represents a larger share of global economic output than the alliance of wealthy democracies that Washington has anchored for 8 decades. And those countries are not just gathering for summits and issuing communiques. They are building alternative payment systems. They are conducting bilateral trade in their own currencies. They are constructing a parallel institutional architecture, development banks, security frameworks, diplomatic channels that operates entirely outside the reach of American leverage. Now, here is the part that really matters for the American people specifically, because it is tempting to watch all of this as if it were happening somewhere else to someone else, as if the geopolitical rearrangement of the global order were a distant abstraction with no direct impact on life in this country. That temptation is a mistake. The dollar's global reserve status is not just a point of national pride. It is the mechanism through which the United States has been able to run massive fiscal deficits without the kind of currency crisis that would have destroyed any other economy. It is the mechanism through which American consumers have enjoyed cheaper imported goods. It is the mechanism through which Washington has been able to fund its military at a scale that no other country on earth can match. And if the dollar's dominance erodes, not collapses overnight, but erodes gradually, as it is clearly beginning to do, then the cost of everything that dollar dominance has been subsidizing gets passed directly to the American people in the form of higher borrowing costs, higher prices, and a diminished standard of living. No major power in history has ever voluntarily surrendered control, much less command, of an alliance it built and led. Doing so at a moment of profound geopolitical upheaval would weaken the transatlantic partnership and leave the United States less secure. That sentence from one of the most serious foreign policy journals in the world is worth reading twice, because what it is describing is not just a NATO story. It is a story about a country that built the most powerful alliance system in human history, ran it for nearly 8 decades, used it to shape the entire global order in its image, and is now, under the pressure of debt, political division, and strategic overextension, beginning to let go of pieces of it. not in a controlled strategic handoff designed to preserve American influence at a higher level of efficiency, but in a way that is driven by domestic political pressures, by the fiscal reality of unsustainable debt, and by a nationalist instinct that mistakes the shedding of commitments for the restoration of strength. The Venezuela operation fits perfectly into this pattern. It is not the action of a confident, strategically coherent superpower that is restructuring its global commitments in a disciplined way. It is the action of an empire that is simultaneously trying to retreat from expensive multilateral commitments in Europe while reasserting raw Monroe Doctrine dominance in its own hemisphere, and doing so in a way that is alienating the entire global South, accelerating de-dollarization, handing Beijing and Moscow a massive propaganda and strategic gift, and setting the stage for exactly the kind of prolonged, messy, unwinnable entanglement that America has stumbled into every single time it has confused the capture of a leader with the resolution of a conflict. Before Trump acted on Venezuela, 70% of Americans polled opposed military action, and the intervention was deeply unpopular, even within his own MAGA coalition, with voices like Marjorie Taylor Greene explicitly calling out endless military aggression and foreign wars as precisely what MAGA voters thought they had voted against. That political fracture is significant because it tells you something important about where this country actually is in its relationship with its own imperial role. The American people are tired. They are tired of wars that cost trillions and produce chaos. They are tired of being told that the next intervention will be different, will be clean, will pay for itself. And that exhaustion is completely legitimate. The tragedy is that the exhaustion is being channeled not into a genuinely coherent strategic retrenchment, but into a kind of lurching, contradictory half-withdrawal that manages to combine the worst of both worlds, abandoning the multilateral commitments that actually generated American influence, while simultaneously plunging into unilateral military adventures that generate resentment, blowback, and long-term strategic costs. What you are watching, if you are willing to look at it clearly and honestly, is a great power in transition, not in collapse. Let's be precise about that. The United States remains, by every measurable military metric, the most powerful country on earth. It still has the largest and most technologically advanced military. It still controls the global reserve currency, at least for now. It still has alliance relationships that no other country on earth can match. But the question was never whether America would fall off a cliff overnight. The question has always been whether America can manage the transition from unipolar hegemon to leading power in a multipolar world, whether it can make that transition in a way that preserves its core interests, maintains its alliances, and protects the living standards of its own people. And what the NATO command restructuring and the Venezuela intervention together suggest is that right now, in 2026, the answer to that question is deeply uncertain. The choices being made are not the choices of a country that has thought carefully and strategically about how to navigate this transition. They are the choices of a country that is reacting, improvising, and in some cases, repeating the exact same mistakes that accelerated its overextension in the first place. The world is watching, and the world is drawing conclusions. And those conclusions are shaping a new global order that, once it solidifies, will be extraordinarily difficult to reverse.